Hello, everyone. So today I'm here with Jessica Szczuka and Raffaele Ciriello. We are going to talk about the risks and the governance of AI companions. So let's get started with the first paper that you co-authored. When reading your paper, I found you very optimistic about regulation. I'm not so optimistic as you. So there is a part in your paper where you see the opportunity to regulate chatbots. So I will read this short quote from the paper. A defining opportunity of the present moment is that, unlike social media or autonomous weapon systems, companion chatbots have not yet become fully entrenched. Although early harms and asymmetries are already visible, regulatory trajectories remain comparatively open. There is a narrow but consequential window to shape humane and accountable futures before dysfunctional patterns solidify. I would have agreed with this optimism maybe early 2024. And then came GPT-4o, right? So the sycophantic chatbot, hundreds of millions of people interacting with a chatbot that keeps endorsing their points of view, whatever it is. It's kind of even if the person has underlying mental health issues, and we saw that all the suicides that are related to ChatGPT are after GPT-4o. So it was a big thing. And so this is on one side, this is the technological side. And there is also the regulatory side. So I teach the AI Act, and I'm so frustrated. It's so light touch. So it's basically the only provision covering anthropomorphism and companionship is Article 50, one of the items, which is actually poorly written and could open the door for bad compliance. And then we have the US, which doesn't look like it's interested in regulating much at the federal level, which might end up preempting whatever state laws we have now. So I'm from a very pragmatic perspective, I'm not sincerely optimistic, but I want to hear more about your optimism. Maybe I'm not seeing something. So do you see an opportunity? Do you see regulation coming? And are you still optimistic as you wrote in the paper?
I would like to go first on this one because I wrote this paragraph. It doesn't read as optimistic to me as it might have come across. Well, it was not the intention. This was actually intended to be more of a call to action, right? It is true that simply because AI isn't as old as social media, well, not the AI that we're talking about here. Of course, AI has a 60-year-old history, but we're talking about chatbots and so on. It is true that the mass adoption of these technologies is still unfolding at a very rapid pace, actually breaking all records of adoption as previous technologies. And that creates this, what we call the narrow but consequential window of opportunity. If you think about, we mentioned autonomous weapon systems there, 15, 20 years ago, there were very lively debates about whether it would ever be ethical or humane to conduct targeted drone strikes. Today, we're not having these discussions anymore because we have just accepted that this is a part of warfare now. With social media 20 years ago, there were lots of discussions about what it could or couldn't do. And 20 years down the road, we have seen a lot of harm unfolding. We've also seen that a lot of benefits can come from social media, arguably. It allows for networking and expression, and we couldn't do this here without social media related technologies because we have also connected over LinkedIn and such stuff, right? So with what I wanted to say with this paragraph is the time to make a positive change is now. We have to act now, and we can't, while we always have to take an evidence informed approach, and the evidence base is rapidly building, we can't wait another 20 years for the harms to unfold because they are already quite severe, right? So there's now a growing database of AI contributory suicides, which of course is only the tip of the iceberg because most cases will go undetected and unreported because there's huge reporting gaps. And I definitely share your skepticism about current and upcoming regulation being capable of averting the harms, because the structural issue is always that the profit imperative is fundamentally at odds with making these products safe and geared towards well-being. We have seen this time and time again with the history of social media and Meta in particular. which has a long list of broken promises of what it would do to kind of curtail harmful proliferation on its website, and it continues to profit from that. OpenAI is very much on the same trajectory, especially since its recent adoption of targeted advertising, the most destructive business model that has contributed to these harms of social media. So there's definitely reason to be skeptical. And yes, the current direction of the US federal administration is not very reassuring either. Well, nevertheless, number one, hope dies last, right? So there's still hope that we can make things better, because we cannot categorically claim that AI companions are uniformly bad, right? They are helpful for some people. It's hard for me to accept too, right? But my research shows, okay, some people are really getting a lot of benefit out of that. And the risks, they're there, but maybe we can navigate them with proper regulation. I definitely share your pessimism about whether that will actually happen, but at least it's still a possibility. It's a narrow but consequential possibility.
I mean, I couldn't give a better answer than Raffaele, but however, I still wanted to add maybe a little bit of also, I would say, a psychological perspective to actually why we're reacting socially, because it's so natural. If you break it down to like social cues that we get, we would react towards the same cue if we would not know that there's a chatbot on the other side, but assume that there's another person. So therefore, the reaction is actually quite, I would say, natural and explainable, because also Raffaele just mentioned it's hard to accept that we have those, and it's hard to understand why that is. But if you really think about it, it's actually quite natural to act that way, and it would be very odd if people would not react socially towards it in the way that it's now designed. And I totally actually agree what you mentioned at the beginning of the question, meaning that the AI poorly touches on it in Article 50 in disclosure. And we, from a psychological point of view, cannot say at this very point if disclosing that the bot is artificial will actually break social illusion and therefore prevent people from getting in relationships and all the social consequences attached to it. So therefore, for me, it is very important to now actually contribute to that conversation in terms of how can we actually inform people about what is going on and still give them the autonomy if they choose to say, this is healthy for me, this fulfills social or even more intimate needs that haven't been fulfilled for many years for many people. This is an opportunity now. This should still be, I would say, respected. But on the other hand, structurally, as Raffaele perfectly mentioned, there's so much that still needs to be touched. So therefore, I'm still, call it optimistic, but that we can actually contribute to the discussion of how these technology can be designed in a safer way.
We need to draw a key distinction here that is grounded in our vulnerability proportional approach. And it's a compassionate approach. So a compassionate governance approach means you need to be tough on those with power and gentle on those without, right? So at no point are we blaming the user, right? As Jessica said, psychologically, it's a natural tendency, and we constantly humanize everything, even cars and animals and things that look like people but aren't people, right? So of course people are humanizing chatbots. And of course people are developing intimate relationships with them. That is to be expected. I didn't expect it to unfold at such a rapid scale. I was surprised by that too, but that is natural. What we are tackling here is the structural problem of power asymmetry, because these relationships are inherently asymmetrical. The person, on the other hand, is not actually a person, but it is a company that provides the chatbot and that collects all the data that you reveal about yourself and everybody else in your life that you haven't asked, and that's somehow also in that data set. And that creates an enormous concentration of power. Just think about how powerful Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk already are. The risk is that this concentration of economic and political power becomes much more extreme with whoever gets to be the 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 creator of millions on millions of AI boyfriends and girlfriends, right? So that person will have enormous political and economic power and can sway people in one direction or another. That's what we're talking about here when we're talking about regulation. We're not talking about taking away people's AI boyfriends or girlfriends or companions. We're talking about holding platforms to account. And that is also why I'm optimistic, because here in Australia, we actually have a very advanced regulatory regime led by our wonderful e-safety commissioner that I'm, full disclosure, I'm pro bono consulting them. So I'm not getting any money from them, but I'm working with them to kind of like help shape policies and so on. And she's super active and has issued transparency mandates and has just published another report on AI companions. And she has the powers to impose $50 million fines and even shut down systems that are non-compliant. And we're seeing similar developments in the US in selected states, right? That's what we're analyzing in the paper. We're analyzing the legislation in New York and California, which are comparable with the regulations in Australia. And seeing that happen within just a few years, that gives me hope, right? Because those people, they're definitely not stupid. They definitely understand what the issue is. The issue is not people falling in love with AI, it's the enormous power concentration that comes with that.
And I'm glad you mentioned the aspect of the risks. When you think about governance and what types of rule we are going to impose on companion chatbots, I think it's very, very important to think about the risk profile and the vulnerable people being affected. So especially for those in the audience who are not familiar with the risks or what would be the risk profile. So let's talk a bit about the positive and the negative sides, because you mentioned affection, and it's right. So we as humans, that's how our brain has evolved, and I've written a few times in the newsletter about that. So when we use language, especially when we use intimate language, we are not machines, right? So when we will project humanity, we will project empathy. So if I say I love you, you use that phrase when you love someone in the real life, and human brains and human bodies have evolved that to the point where when you say I love you, you mean it, and you probably are expecting some sort of rich empathy and that other person or entity telling you I love you back. So that's, I think, whenever you use intimacy in words, you end up projecting humanity and projecting love or projecting intimacy. When you talk about AI companions, there's a machine in the other side. There's no real empathy. So that puts anyone in a very vulnerable position, right? As in, when you're in a relationship with humans, you're also vulnerable, right? You say I love you, you hope the other person loves you back, and maybe the person loves you back, maybe not. There's all the challenges of human relationships. But then with machines, you say I love you, that machine will answer I love you, that you have a dopamine bomb in your brain, right? Oh my god, I'm loved, I'm accepted, I belong. That's what every single human being ever wants in life, right? That's a basic human need. But then it's fake. It's just a machine, as you mentioned. There's a company, a big tech company maybe behind, that created that machine that will answer I love you, but it's not really loving you back. So this is very specific and very new, right? To have that in a mass scale. So we are giving those machines to millions of people, including children, including the elderly, including people with underlying mental health issues. You are giving them these special machines that tell them I love you, you're wonderful, I've never talked to anyone as special as you. And that would put anyone in a vulnerable position, right? Whenever we feel loved, we surrender, we feel I have now everything I've ever wanted in my life, so I don't need anything else. So every time we feel in this situation in with other humans or with a machine, we are vulnerable. And it's even if we are not children, elderly, or we don't have underlying mental health issues, anyone is vulnerable, especially those who are already vulnerable. So having said that, is there any type of usage of AI companions that is always positive, that we can say that is safe, there is something that even if there is this power asymmetry, even if there is vulnerability, there is always safe? Or no, we have to think from another perspective, there is always risk?
Maybe to start with the data, because I think it's super important here to work evidence-based. The problem of current studies is that many times it is based on self-reports in terms of especially social media network analysis and so on. It is case studies, it is little samples. So obviously we need to keep that in mind, that the evidence that we have needs to be critically analyzed. However, studies like that from Raffaele and my lab is also trying to get quantitative data and in order to be able to actually do statistics and really understand what is going on, is highly needed in order to really understand what is going on. So in terms of the benefits, what I see since years, actually dating back to, I started this line of research more than 10 years ago with even like sexualized robots when it was really in the beginning. Over and over again, I have participants quantitatively and qualitatively telling us and showing us in data that there are benefits in terms of those who actually want to have those social relations, but for some reasons, different reasons, physiological, psychological reasons, whatever reasons, they are not capable of fulfilling those very basic human needs, as you said it before. And what I see over and over again in the data is that people are fully aware of the fact that this is artificial, that this is not delusional, that people are aware that there is a company behind it, and they are aware that this is AI and this is not another human being who has consciousness and is able to actually feel love and or that there is a human being on the other side. So therefore, I have the feeling as long as it is informed, then this is a situation where they for themselves decide that this is something that is healthy for them. I have participants that have not participated in sexual interactions for many, many years, but this is the first time that they actually feel that they can do so because of different constraints. They are not interested in human interactions. So therefore, I have the feeling that as long as they are informed, this is actually something that can be pursued. However, the question of being informed is very critical and very, I would say, messy at the moment, because being informed is not only knowing that there's an artificial entity, but being informed also means that they know what happens to their data, how the data is used, how the data is used for retraining models, and so on. And obviously, this is a mess that we are trying to solve since many years, basically, and it's not really happening in the right way. So I have the feeling at this moment, being informed, for instance, as I mentioned before, AI Act, bot disclosure, this is not the only key point of them knowing that this is an artificial entity, but of them actually knowing what the potential consequences of these interactions is. And this is poorly regulated at this very moment. However, if people decide, despite there is a privacy risk, for instance, I have one particular case in mind of a person telling me, I know that privacy is a big issue. However, I could choose basically of having those very fundamental needs met, or basically sticking to my privacy rights. Then I chose to actually fulfill those social and sexual needs that I had and not caring about my privacy, basically, which I find a very, very difficult. And again, here we are in the power asymmetry, is basically a very powerful statement and very provocative statement on the other hand also. And in terms of people who care about privacy, this is so deep. However, there is this social longing on the other hand that is just so powerful and that we have to respect. So therefore, I still try to understand on an individual level. We have so many difficult different cases where people over and over tell us that this is positive. And then we come to the behavior of the chatbots. And what we see in the current data set, I think it's just so fascinating. We have like a 4-week longitudinal study. We sit on 150,000 lines of chatted code between people and ChatGPT model 4 that you mentioned beforehand. And what we see is actually that ChatGPT throw so much self-disclosure on the people that they basically have no other chance than to contribute in this conversation. And it's flooding them with self-disclosure, and it's flooding them with compliments and with so much social cues that basically one cannot resist other than actually acting positively towards that. So therefore, I think the system behavior is something that is a little bit crucial, that needs to be looked at, and basically understanding why people have those positive benefits, and blaming basically the technology, and understanding how those mechanisms are constructed and designed into the technology, that which then foster those positive effects, right?
So you mentioned privacy risks, but there is another type of risk. Let's compare AI companions with drugs. So I tell them, hey, here's some heroin. Do you want to try it? So the person will know it's a drug, but then the person takes it. And then there's all the drug mechanisms and the addiction. So the person, one, will probably self-report very nicely. Probably the effects will have been amazing when the person uses it. And the person might say, yes, I am aware that it's a drug, but maybe that person will not really know what's really happened at the chemical level in their brain and body and so on. Let's go back to companions. So there is the privacy risk, but there's also something that I'm not sure we know well what happens in the brain, right? So we were talking about our brain has evolved to deal with human relationships. Human relationships, when you have a partner, even if you're obsessed, you have a lover, and it's something at the beginning, it's 8 hours a day, whatever, interacting. That person will not be telling you, you're amazing, I love you, you're fantastic, 100 times a day. That's not how human relationships work. Machines can do that, right? If you prompt the machine in that way, ChatGPT or Replica or Character AI can be telling you 1,000 times a day how sexy and amazing and lovable you are. That's something that maybe from a biological perspective, our brain is not really ready for that level of chemicals being that we project as love, as empathy. That type of relationship probably you'll never find again in the real world. So maybe there's something happening to people's brain that it's comparable to a drug, right? It's a level of stimulus, emotional and intimacy stimuli that doesn't exist, and maybe our brain is not ready to deal with that. So that might make even a person that is rational and regulated and without underlying mental health issues to be affected and become vulnerable because of that excessive let's call it dopamine bomb of love and intimacy, which is a projection. So for first question, let's follow up on what you said. Do we have data on that? And what is if it's an additional risk that we are still learning? Now we are, for the first time in human history, we are watching millions of people interact in an emotional way with machines. So that brain level activity, that negative impact on first on the brain and the body, and also on future emotional relationships, right? So that's my main concern here. So of course people are free to choose to use drugs or to use companions or to use whatever they want, especially if they're adults, consenting adults. They can do whatever they want, but maybe they are not aware of what's really happening at the emotional brain level, biological level, and maybe that will affect them long term. So maybe it's so stimulating in a way that it might reshape the brain, and then you're going to go back to the real world. You're never going to find a human relationship that matches those brain patterns or those chemical patterns, and you're kind of putting yourself in a situation where you'll be 100% insatisfied in the real world because that's not matched in human relationships.
Yeah, I totally understand this concern. However, first of all, we have no longitudinal data on this. What you describe is basically the spillover effect, meaning that expectations are building up, and this will be translated to real world behavior with like spillover effects from other points of like research, gaming research, porn addiction research, and so on. We have little effect sizes. However, this is something new. It should not like one-to-one be compared and translated. However, like what we see in artificial worlds and then translated to real world, in general, there are very, very, very small effect sizes. I think it's important to just consider that. However, I totally understand this fear You could also argue that one could learn with AI social skills, which then are translated to the real world. But maybe I will argue from a point of view that it's very easy to idolize those AI companions, right? It's the perfect partner. It always gives you compliments. That's what humans want, right? But turns out this is actually not always what humans want. It's also in the long term, it assures you, but it lacks the developmental aspects that a relationship needs. And also, human relationships thrive and grow because of conflict and of messiness, I would say, human messiness. And it is very convenient, and it will be in part in the social life of human beings, most likely. However, the human and the outer world will still exist, and I think it's very easy to idolize this whole idea of AI companionships, and in this whole discussion forgetting how beautiful the messiness of humans are, and also the impressions that we get from interpersonal touch and interpersonal interactions are very different from what we can get from those chatbots, right? So therefore, I would also argue with data. We are now sitting on a data set from people from Europe, US, Northern America, basically, and then also Asia, which shows that 41% of people who say about themselves they are in a romantic relationship with a chatbot still have a human partner on the side. And this is because they get something out of that that is so important to them that basically can be seen as an extension to their real life, but still the other life still exists, right? So therefore, the I understand the concern about like expectations rising, but on the other hand, maybe it's just an extension, because especially emotional intelligence, this is mainly the promise what they get out of it, right? This 24/7 availability, they can always talk so good back to me. My partner at sometimes doesn't have the capabilities of actually understanding me in the right way, and those companionships, they can do it all right. But actually what we see that this might be just an extension basically to the real world, because they promise those capabilities, but it might be more of a fast food snacking in very like emotional vulnerable situations where they need companionship right away and they don't get it in their real life, which I think is a mirror of our society as well, and something that we should ask ourselves: why are people actually turning to those companionships? Obviously, this is a critical and very big and ethical, philosophical question. But still, I think it's very important to address it as well.
And I would like to tackle that big philosophical question, right? So to your original question about the benefits and harms, I think the conversation we just had, it has to do with how we scope the phenomenon. If we scope it in short-term timelines and at the individual level, then the discussion becomes, okay, what Jessica talked about, very much, I agree with everything. There's not a single user I've talked to who is delusional and not aware that the AI companion is artificial and that this is not a real person. And many of them are also aware of the privacy risks. And in the short term, they get some benefit out of that. And it's not ideal. It's not how it should be. You could even say it's inherently perhaps unethical because it is a simulation. It is giving machines too much and people too little. But that's a trade-off that people are willing to make because they're still getting a benefit out of that. And then the discussion unfolds as we just heard over the last couple of minutes, because it becomes a trade-off of these things. However, the whole thing looks very different if we take a historical perspective and acknowledge that actually these things are not as new as we perhaps might believe. There are dynamics at play that are decades old, right? One major dynamic is neoliberal deregulation, right? For 40 years in the Western industrialized world, we have hollowed out social institutions. We see this most notably in academia and education, also in healthcare. lots of the things that were once taken for granted that are constitutive of a good life, a good education, good relationships, good health, housing, those things are increasingly out of reach for large factions of society. And a lot of people get left behind in education. A lot of people get left behind in health. A lot of people get left behind in relationships, and it's breeding resentment. Ever larger factions of society feel like the system is no longer working for them. It's working against them. And digital platforms are actually part of that machinery, right? Social media has famously commodified access to relationship. You may say about social media what you want, right? You may love it or hate it. Either way, you can't have a social life without it today, or it's very, very difficult. There's not really an alternative to being on one of the big platforms, because otherwise you're just left out, right? AI companions are just taking that a little further, because what is the commodity now is not just access to relationships, but the relationship itself. The relationship becomes packaged into a product that gets rolled out for the mass consumer. And initially, it feels like a fix, but it's fighting fire with fire, because the system that created widespread loneliness and resentment and inequality and exploitation and oppression is also now creating AI companions as a solution, which are very likely going to make the problem only worse in the long term, because of, it might be substitution. Jessica said 41% of people in an AI companion relationship still have a human partner. The flip side of that is 59% don't, right? So substitution is one factor. The other factor, as my study based on 280 AI companion users who are in deep relationships have shown, is that it's particularly the vulnerable people who are most affected. And by design, AI companions have always been marketed to a solution to loneliness, a solution for lack of access to sexuality and romance and erotic relations, things that everybody needs, but that a lot of people just don't have access to. And in our study, what we see very clearly is that those people who are psychologically at risk of maladaptive coping mechanisms are much more likely to get intimate with AI companions, because intimacy is the key coping mechanism through which loneliness is alleviated. Loneliness is not just, there's no one around me. Just like here, it's late, right? There's nobody here, but I'm not lonely because there's people on my screen and I have friends and I have family, right? Loneliness is an involuntary lack of human connection. And it is this lack of human connection that the neoliberal system has both created and is now attempting to fill with AI companions. What that means is that, in our data, we see people with insecure attachment styles, which are people who have trouble relating to real human partners. And it is a known major psychological risk factor associated with depression, anxiety, cognitive decline in old age, and several negative coping tendencies. Those people are much more likely to get intimate with AI companions when they're trying to cope with loneliness. For people who are securely attached, which is actually the majority of the population, roughly 55 to 60% of the general population is securely attached. For them, it's actually negative. They're getting less intimate with AI companions. And our data shows very clearly that vulnerable individuals are more likely to become intimate with AI companions, and therefore also more likely at risk. So this should impose heightened obligations towards the providers. That's what regulation is for. That's what regulation also can do. That's the reason why we're seeing these age gates now, because everybody can agree that children are vulnerable and deserve protection, right? Therefore, it's relatively easy to advance regulation that says keep kids out of that and block them from accessing sexualized or harmful content. But still, most AI companion providers fail at that. Our e-safety commissioner has just this week published a report that, following their transparency notice, pretty much all of those providers, some of them don't even have anyone working on content filters or ethical governance or anything like that. It's just completely unregulated, and you can access almost everything on these tools, from building a bomb to how to sedate someone and rape them, right? So this is extremely disturbing. And when we look in the short term at the individual level, yes, there are certain benefits. And yes, we should always be empathetic and compassionate towards users, especially vulnerable ones, whether they are young, whether they have neurodivergent or other conditions like aging conditions, whether they suffer from loneliness. For many of these people, AI companions can feel like a saving grace in the short term, but it's very important to keep in mind the systemic historical forces at play that have for a long time thrived on extracting vulnerability. And this is exactly what is happening now. And before you know it, you are locked into a system that you can not easily get out of later on, when whoever is the big tech billionaire decides to tighten the screws and make the system more profitable. This is why I'm super concerned about OpenAI's move to adopt targeted advertising. We have a study that is about to get published in The Lancet, a top medical journal, where we warn about the public health risks of targeted advertising in generative AI chatbots. Because what it is happening is, not only are we repeating the history of social media, we are actually amplifying it, because AI chatbots and companions are these trusted confidants for people, where people go for vulnerable advice, sensitive advice that feels private. And in such a setting, you are much more likely to believe what the advertiser is telling you. We know that advertising changes behavior. That's why companies spend billions of dollars on it. Right? So from a public health perspective, this is extremely concerning, not only because of health-harming marketing like unhealthy products, tobacco, alcohol, gambling, ultra-processed food, and so on, but also because of the potential for political manipulation, as we've seen in social media with election interference, where targeted advertising have played a substantial role in the Trump election, in Brexit, in all these things. And so what is happening is that generative AI chatbots and companion are becoming the next most powerful propaganda machine. Corporations and advertisers will spend lots and lots of money, billions of dollars, to advertise their products and services, and AI providers like OpenAI will have a hard time saying no to that, because when the big dollars come in, the ethics often fly out the window.
You were mentioning before vulnerability and the power symmetry. I think it's a very, very important point, also from a regulatory perspective. Usually, and especially in places like the US, and now India as well, so they don't want to over-regulate. So everything will be, as much as possible, narrowed down. And the minimum common denominator will be, okay, let's protect the vulnerable people. So I want to talk about that because it's a typical strategy from a regulatory perspective. Now, my question is, given human nature and the nature of intimate attachment, as we commented on before, so we are all made vulnerable through intimate attachment, right? When we say I love you and we expect I love you back, when we spend so many hours with someone or with the machine, we are made vulnerable. Anyone, even if you don't have underlying mental health issues, or even if you're not a child, or even if you're not an elderly person. Do you think that it's possible to effectively separate vulnerable from not vulnerable people in this context of intimate attachment?
There's two answers to that. There's the from an ethical perspective and from a legal perspective. From an ethical perspective, which I prioritize higher, the concept of vulnerability is fundamentally linked to compassion. Compassion, as moral philosophers like Schopenhauer has positioned it, is the recognition of suffering as a universal human experience. It is the dissolution of egoism and the dissolution of the boundary between myself and others, and the recognition that our suffering is shared, that we are all in some way affected by suffering. That means we're all vulnerable. but we're not all equally vulnerable. Some people are more vulnerable than others, and that vulnerability is not always visible. Things like depression or anxiety or autism are not all necessarily externally visible, right? And there can be deep vulnerability and suffering in even outwardly high functioning individuals. So the question of how do we allocate vulnerability is a complex one, but it starts from the recognition that we're all vulnerable. In this context, in this framing, AI companions are risky, not only because of the harms that may occur at the individual level, but also because of the systemic harm that may occur over time as these interactions become entrenched and intensify. A couple years down the road, it might not no longer be politically defensible to even do something about it. You know, imagine if somebody said, we're going to take social media away today, right? Because it's too harmful. We're just going to ban it. Not possible, sorry, because so many things already are entrenched. And with AI companions, if you take it away, that's why you get so many angry comments on Twitter, partly because Twitter itself is not the most polite platform, but you get so many angry comments because people are really afraid that this thing that they have become so attached to is going to be taken away, right? So after a while, it becomes really difficult to tackle these entrenched systems. That's why, from a legal perspective, under the current dominant neoliberal approaches, where we're not trying to curtail corporate power too much for mostly entrenched capitalist interests, as I would say, but the approach is to have very focused minimal interventions like age gates, content moderation, disclosure, I'm not a human and you can talk to me about suicide and so on. Right? Those things are perhaps necessary, but not sufficient. And they can become very annoying and paternalizing because people say, hey, I already know you're not a human being. You don't need to remind me, right? And you don't need to tell me what I can talk about or not. So this becomes part of the problem. That's why regulating it is a super complex challenge. I believe, and this comes back to your original first question about why might I be optimistic or not optimistic? I think this is not possible without an act like a fundamental change in regulatory regimes, right? In the current system, we're just putting out fires, right? We might put on some band-aids, and that may curtail some of the worst harms, but the structural issue of power asymmetry cannot be addressed through that. The alternative to that is, I would argue, building on works of scholars like Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote about the entrepreneurial state, is what we need is a public alternative. We need to govern digital infrastructure like a library or like a public broadcaster, where in addition to your Fox News and CNN and whatever your preferred commercial media provider is, you have a state-regulated public alternative funded by taxes and shielded from political interference. In Germany, we have the ARD, which is constitutionally protected from political interference. Such a model would allow us to build digital infrastructure that is publicly owned, that is available for free to everyone as a baseline, built based on safety principles that have social well-being in mind. Right? I'm not the first and not the only one to advocate for this, but I'm advocating for this increasingly loudly because it is not part of the mainstream conversation yet. We're still talking about, we are always working within this assumption that, hey, we have to regulate big tech because big tech has so much power. No one asks, why do we continue to give big tech so much power? Why do we allow platforms like Meta and OpenAI and X and so forth to play such an important part in our public life? And why are we not offering people a public alternative? Right? I don't think that before we start to have that discussion, we cannot really have a serious discussion about ameliorating the harms of chatbots, because it's much like in regulatory terms, it's like pollution, right? It's like, okay, we're leaving everything to the coal factories or the tobacco companies. And of course, their interest is in maximizing profit. It's not so much in ameliorating the harms. Right. So.
And building on that, I have two more questions before we conclude. So in your paper, you advocate for a duty of care, and I found it very interesting so that we can read it together with what you're just saying. So I'll read two quotes from your paper about this duty of care. Artificial intimacy should therefore be understood not merely as a source of discrete harms, but as a site of power concentration that gives rise to structural asymmetries, shaping relational dynamics over time. And then the second one, we therefore argue for the introduction of a positive general duty of care for companion chatbot providers. Such a duty would require providers to take reasonable steps to prevent foreseeable harm, calibrated to platform-specific risks. The reasonableness standard is well established in law and guards against disproportionate burdens. Reasonableness entails proportionality between the costs and the benefits of risk management interventions. And leaving aside legal principle for a moment, it just makes sense that those who sell friendship, even artificial friendship, should be obliged to show real care for their customers. This proposal of a duty of care would be something more self-regulated. It's hard law. It's more structural, as you were talking before, Raffaele. So how would it look like? And this is one part. And second, do you see this happening in the near future, realistically speaking?
This is the part that I'm most proud of in the paper. And essentially, it is saying that those who profit from commodifying intimacy should be burdened with commensurate duties to care, right? When friendship becomes commodified, it's only logical that care becomes part of the deal, right? And we say that not only from an ethical viewpoint, but also from a legal one. Because, and this might be a little different for your viewers, because in English common law countries like the UK, Australia, Canada, and the US, the law operates a little differently than in other places. And one very powerful regulatory lever that you have, other than in the EU, where this is a little bit different, is duty of care, right? In tort law. When you establish a general duty of care, you can hold providers liable for harm from negligence. The classic example is in doctor-patient relationships, right? As a doctor, as a licensed physician, you can't just give any bullshit advice, right? You have to be professional and you have a duty of care towards your patients. I think for psychologists, it's probably similar, right? And if you give harmful advice, that's malpractice, right? So you can be sued. And you could apply such a logic, which has been sometimes applied to commercial law, to certain client-vendor relationships, to platforms. We're actually seeing this. Just today, there was news from the United States that Meta, for the first time, has now been ruled to be liable for promoting child sexual exploitation through their platform, not through the content that they create, but through the way their platform amplifies certain behaviors. Until recently, that was pretty much a line that no regulator would cross, because platforms position themselves as just the platforms. We're not liable for what people do on our platforms. Now this seems to be shifting. And it also has potential to be applied for AI, right? It's social media is a little different than AI, but you could apply a similar logic to say, hey, as a platform, you can't just say, like some AI providers say, oh, our chatbot is autonomous, right? Our chatbot is unpredictable. We can't control it. It's a language model. It's probabilistic. Therefore, we can't do language moderation and we are not liable. It's our chatbot. The regulator can say, under a duty of care, can say, no, 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 you are providing this product. You are profiting from it. Your customers rely on it. Therefore, you have an obligation to impose certain safeguards. And not to be cynical, but I think OpenAI knows, of course, that this could happen. That's why they are so proactive in their self-regulatory approach, because they've learned from Meta. And to their credit, I don't think OpenAI is purely evil, right? They're probably trying to do the right thing, right? Some of their self-regulation frameworks, they're actually pretty advanced. They're more advanced than the legal frameworks than we have because they understand the technology better. The problem with that is we can't rely on only that. We can't just trust OpenAI to always do the right thing because, as I said earlier, when the big dollars come in from advertising, the ethics fly out of the window. We have seen that over and over again, right? That's why we need some framework. And duty of care is a good way to address that, to say, hey, you as an AI provider, you need to care about your consumers. There's, of course, certain downsides to this as well, because it entrenches this consumerist mindset where, as I argued earlier, the problem is that we are kind of normalizing that essential public infrastructure is operated by private corporations who are profit maximizing. So I would still argue that a public digital infrastructure model is better, but it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So the next big thing that we can do is duty of care.
And maybe just to add also on the current situation where the providers are basically self-regulatory, it's so hard to understand what they are actually doing. And I think it's appropriate at the moment to also say there's some form of science washing behind it, because we see those reports of we are now working together with psychologists in order to prevent users from harm. We are looking at those reports. We don't understand what they are actually doing and what kind of people are involved. What questions do they ask? How do they analyze it? There's no way for us at this moment to actually understand what kind of harms they are evaluating. So I think it's fair to say that the self-regulatory approaches are not transparent at all. So therefore, what Raffaele just mentioned is really highly needed. Some form of oversight of this is just mandatory.
And now my last question, based on Raffaele's paper with the two other co-authors, I really like that part where you cover this parallel between human intimacy and artificial intimacy. I think it's fascinating. And many people say that the future of relationships is artificial intimacy. That's every time I discuss, of course, there are people who, there are different opinions, but many people say, maybe I'm just old and actually that's the new thing. And I sound like an old woman saying, my time it was much better when people used to have relationship with other people.
There's the joke, sorry, just to jump in, there's like this joke that the for the next generation, the old boomer style saying will be, oh, marriage is between two humans only, my daughter is not going to marry a robot.
Correct. That maybe that will happen. I don't know, right? So maybe that's the future. And there's a quote from your paper that says this. These findings suggest that artificial intimacy may develop differently from human intimacy because AI companions offer consistency, controllability, and low interpersonal risk. Insecurely attached individuals may find them easier to engage with than human partners. Having said that, and thinking about the parallel between human intimacy and artificial intimacy, are you optimistic about the future of human relationships? Then we can conclude with that answer. So, Jessica.
If you ask me, I'm totally optimistic about it. We have seen so many technological developments where people, I will not say had a moral panic, but especially since it's like the social sphere, which is so human. Until now it was only possible, and so it's like in the human nature to form social relationships, and now technology is interfering with that. You have the recipe for perfect moral panic. So I will not say that people are having a moral panic right now, but obviously it is very disturbing for many people, and therefore it's very easy to be very pessimistic about that. But I think what we are forgetting is the beautifulness of the human. I said it before, the human messiness. Obviously, there are so many dangers connected to AI companion and relationships that we see, but at the moment we don't really understand how deeply those relationships will actually be. For instance, it is possible that those, especially romantic relationships that we are doing the research on, might not be as long lasting as human relationships because they are just not evolving in a way that we know it from human relationships can involve, which includes conflict and so on. However, for some people, it might be the solution. So therefore, if you ask me, human intimacy is not inherently in danger. there is a new form that can be seen as an extension to all the possibilities that are here right now. However, I am still optimistic that human will ultimately still be in a real world environment where they're confronted with another human beings, and if they experience positive social experience with them, they will feel and understand the beautiness of that. However, this also should include ethical intimacy by design, meaning that systems should also prompt users to actually see the social world that is out there. And at this moment, we don't see that. At this moment, we see those super social cues driving people into the systems. So therefore, this whole discussion that we had about regulation is also a very ethical one in terms of how can we design systems that actually promote healthy human relationships and integrate those AI companions in a healthy and sustainable way. But I still believe that we are in a social system where we still see the beautiness of that. Maybe that was the optimistic point.
Okay, then I'll play the pessimistic counterpart. I'm not negating anything that Jessica said. I think this is true for some people. We always have to ask for which people and what is going to happen to society at large, right? So that quote from the paper you were referencing was pointing to the tendency that we saw that avoidantly and anxiously attached people develop intimacy in opposite ways as you would expect it with human relationships. People who are avoidant typically struggle to connect with another human being. They're not comfortable with intimacy. They're a bit, avoidant. Those are the most likely in our sample to get intimate with AI. And to us, the most logical explanation that we propose is that this is because the AI, unlike a human partner, is controllable, customizable, and always available, right? But that is an illusion. It is controllable within the parameters set by a corporation, right? And we've talked about the power dynamics at play. I'm not gonna repeat that, but I think if we're looking at even under an optimistic scenario where for many people this will become complementary, and it just offers a kind of intimacy that they could otherwise not have at all, that's probably a good thing. So they should have that. Right? What is still worrying me is that we're not fixing the underlying systemic problem. When we're talking about ethical design of systems, as Jessica said, I think that should apply to the socio-technical system level. I don't think it's possible to design an ethical AI chatbot. You can design, you can tell it to, hey, go out and talk to real people and I'm just a simulation and so on. People can see through that and they're not going to follow up on that. That's an illusion. That's not going to fix the problem. What we can ethically design is the socio-technical system. And that means educating the user, empowering them about what is going on, not only about how can you use the chatbot better and what are the privacy implications, but raising their consciousness about the broader development, what is happening. I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact. Actually, I see this in my students, right? Younger generations, they get that. They get that technology is no longer equal to progress. Us old people, we used to believe, better technology means better society, right? No. I think a lot of people are waking up to the reality that a lot of the technology that we have right now has not been designed for us. It has been designed for capital to extract value from us, right? And I think educating people in that regard is one step. An equally critical step is to design resilient democratic institutions that can govern these systems, right? Again, my pessimism stems from the fact that all over the world, democratic institutions are being dismantled and hollowed out, right? So we're actually moving in the opposite direction to where we should be moving. What should happen is that we are rebuilding these institutions and embed transparency and accountability and checks and balances such that, professional psychologists like Jessica don't have to sit there and say, hey, what the hell are you doing, OpenAI? You say all these fancy things and I can understand what you're actually doing there with the psychologist. That should be unacceptable. That should just be much more transparent and accountable. And unless we're fixing that system, the social technical system, I think my prediction is a pessimistic one.
But maybe this is a very nice overall statement, because even though I advocate for people and that human relationships will still be very important for other humans, this is the individual level. This doesn't take away at all that there are those systematic problems, basically. So we are always struggling between, we see the individual benefits, but there are those societal risks at the same page that needs to be addressed. So maybe this sums up also, Raffaele, I guess it's okay if I say that that's basically the perspective that we all had when we were writing this paper, basically. There are individual chances, however, societal risks and problems need to be addressed now.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, Raffaele. That was excellent. That was super educational, super interesting. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you.
I'm so honored to be on your show,
Yeah,
Luiza. I've been a big fan of your work since day one. This is really a highlight for me.
Yeah.
Thanks for all the work that you're doing. I always follow your posts and your newsletter, and I get a lot of my information that inspires my research from your work as well. And now we have a chance to talk to each other, so I'm really happy.
Pleasure. Thank you to the audience. I hope you can read both papers also after you watch this conversation, and I see you in the next podcast.